Daniel chapter 1, I'm going to begin reading with verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. And he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." And Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." And so he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And so the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. And to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered the king's service. And every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. All right, a familiar story to most of us. And here is what happened to Daniel. His home was destroyed. His country was sieged. There's nothing to go back to. And he comes to this foreign place that was unlike anything he had ever seen. Babylon, and make sure you get this, was an impressive place. And Daniel would have looked around and just would have been overwhelmed by the beauty of the buildings, by the prosperity of the people, by all that he saw in Babylon. And while he's there, he also sees this powerful king. This king who is literally ruling over the whole world. And this king has one of his servants go out, and he picks Daniel and some of his friends among all the people that they had taken over. And he says, "We want you to come to the king's palace. We want you to be in this elite group of people." You see, Nebuchadnezzar just didn't want to capture bodies and capture plunder and stuff. He wanted their minds and their hearts and their souls. And so he invited them into the culture of Babylon. And so you have to wonder, this teenage boy who's in a place he's never been before, seeing things he had never seen before, how is he going to follow God in that place? And as I thought about that, I had to think, how was Daniel raised? How was he brought up? And I'm going off the pages of the Bible here. I'm kind of going to pre-Daniel chapter 1, if you will. Because I don't think Daniel woke up in Babylon one morning and said, you know what? I think this would be a good place for me to start following God. I think I'm going to give God my life fully starting today. You see, I think that was nurtured in Daniel. And so you have to ask, how did Daniel's parents train him? Right? Who were Daniel's Sunday school teachers? Did they teach him to be afraid of Babylon? Or did they teach him to see Babylon as a mission field? You see, friends, if you're afraid of Babylon, if you've been told your whole life how awful Babylon is and how it's taken over and you're afraid of Babylon, when you get there, you're going to do whatever Babylon tells you to do. But if you've been trained, if you've been nurtured to see Babylon as a mission field, then when you get there, you're going to do what you've been nurtured to do. You're going to honor God with your life. And you kind of wonder if in Daniel's Sunday school class at the temple, did they role play some of this? Did they say, okay, there's going to be a day when you might be in Babylon, and they're going to want you to eat different food when you're there. So what are you going to do? Did they work through that as they nurtured Daniel and brought him up? You see, the whole Babylonian captivity thing, that didn't surprise the Hebrew people. They were paying attention. They knew Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful king. They knew Babylon was coming for them. King Jehoiakim had tried to pay off Nebuchadnezzar. And Jehoiakim died, and his son Jehoiakim took over for 3 months until Nebuchadnezzar just comes in and storms through the gates of Israel and takes over his people. But you see, they had been hearing that drumbeat for a long time. And some of them, not many of them, we like to be surprised by obvious things, but some of them had been preparing for their day, for that day. And I think they sat down with their young people. And I believe those parents didn't believe there was anything more important than helping their children conform to the image of God. And I believe the leaders in the synagogue, the leaders of the church, knowing that Babylon was a possibility, said, we've got to put our best teachers. We got to put our best energy. We got to put our best resources in bringing up these children so that they will honor God. We've got to have them mentor in a way that they'll honor God when they're in Babylon. And I think this was the number one priority for this community of faithful people, preparing their young people to be missionaries in Babylon, to live godly lives in an ungodly place. And as I think about that, I wonder what would happen if the church today had that same kind of commitment. If our children weren't afterthoughts, but if they were the priority, that our job was to spiritually form them, to live godly lives in ungodly places. And not just our children, but the children in our culture. What if we believed that God had put us here for such a time as this, to help develop young people who could honor God with their lives? You see, in my lifetime, the church in America, our church, has spent a lot of time convincing us to just be afraid of Babylon. And I want us to learn to teach our children the way Daniel was taught. Friends, we don't need to produce any more bubble-wrapped Christians. We need to produce believers who can live in Babylon and who can honor God with their lives. We got to stop being afraid of Babylon. And we need to gauge our effectiveness by how well our children live in Babylon. See, we don't know who Daniel's parents were. No earthly idea of their names. Don't know who his grandparents were. Don't know who taught him in synagogue. But I can imagine something about their quality of faith by what I see played out in the life of Daniel. And so Daniel had a vibrant faith when he arrived in Babylon. And that's what I'm challenged to think about as a parent and as a pastor. I've got to ask myself, do we produce the kind of children who can go into Babylon and say, I respectfully choose not to eat what the king is providing. I will not give in to the values of Babylon. Or do we sit around biting our nails, saying, oh my goodness, they're going out, they're going off to college, I don't know what's going to happen next. You see, we need to make sure we see this part of the story, that something was nurtured in Daniel that at a very young age, he could, in the most powerful place on earth where he had the least amount of power, live a life that pleased God. Verse 8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself that way. So Daniel made a decision not to allow the culture of Babylon to diminish his relationship with God. Daniel made a decision not to allow the culture of Babylon to diminish his relationship with God. He didn't look around and say, well, it's the culture. What are you going to do? He said, no, I'm going to honor God in this culture. And Daniel and these three Hebrew boys, they weren't persecuted. They weren't tortured. They were fed extravagant food. They were seduced, enticed. They were overindulged. Kind of sounds like our culture. And we're overindulged to the point that we don't have time for God anymore. And the culture has us so busy doing things that we don't have time for God. We don't have time for the church. We don't have time for each other. And Daniel could have been seduced by all of that. But this young man says, no, I will not let the values of this culture define my life. He followed his guide. He chose to make God's word his authoritative guide for faith and practice. But Daniel resolved himself not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Notice what Daniel doesn't do. He doesn't condemn the government official. He doesn't write letters to the editor. He doesn't start a parachurch ministry and send out a bunch of flyers and say, help us battle for the culture. He respectfully asks permission to not participate. Mad Christians are not effective in changing the world. Mad Christians are not effective in changing the world. So let's stop. Daniel respectfully engages people who are against everything Daniel believes in, but he respectfully engages. So why don't we just try some respectful conversations? Why don't we ask, hey, is it okay if I do it this way because of my faith in God? And then you got to add the next part of it, which Daniel was willing to do. Test me. And see if as I live in terms of my relationship to God, faithfully in terms of my relationship with God. See if I live that way, if I'm not a better employee, a better student, a better friend, if I live in God's way. Test me in that. And we need to establish some Daniel test as we follow our guide. Because our culture says, hey, we hear your mouth, but when we test you, like Nebuchadnezzar and the king's officials tested Daniel, when we test you, it doesn't match up. But you see, when they tested Daniel, it matched. And Daniel said, I respectfully ask that you let me live the way that God intends for me to live. And then test me. And if that doesn't make me a better person, then we can do it your way. But you see, Daniel passed the test. And so let me kind of encourage us today to go through some tests this summer. And let me just give you a few maybe that could help us live faithful lives in a different culture. Maybe we could cut down on our engagement with media. iPads, iPhones, computers, Facebook, social media, whatever it is. Maybe we could cut back just a little bit. You think that might make our spiritual lives better? I'm not asking you to do anything too radical. Maybe just cut an hour. Cut an hour a week from your engagement with all of the media. If we all did that, would our worship experiences be better? Individually and when we come together. So cut out some media this summer. You know, if you haven't had the time to notice, we live in a beautiful area of the country. Lots of things to see, to experience around us. Get away from a screen for 1 hour a week this summer. Test. Let me give you another Daniel test. Be intentional about engaging with family, friends, people that are close to you this summer. Talk to each other, right? Take some walks together. Cook a meal together. Do something really radical. Sit down at a table and eat a meal together. You see, when I talk about pre-Daniel 1 and how was Daniel nurtured, one of the things we know is that so many of our young people in previous generations were not nurtured by awkward-looking white guys who preached on Sunday morning. They were nurtured in the kitchen of their home when they helped mom or grandmother primarily cook a meal. And mom and grandmother primarily would reinforce spiritual lessons that they are hearing at church or reading in their own Bible. Folks, we got to spend some time together if we're going to nurture spiritual life. And I wonder if our families would come together, if our friends, if we would be intentional about spending time with each other, could some broken relationships become healed? Would we be able to have some conversations with people who don't yet know Christ? Would we be more patient with each other? Would our thoughts be more about our Savior? So do the test. Spend some time. Be intentional about spending some time with family and friends this summer. Be generous this summer. Let's try that test. Develop a plan to regularly give, to not just spend money on something, just to spend money, to be intentional about not doing that so you can be generous. Too many believers live under the one-day rule of giving. You know that? One day I'm going to, and we're all one day going to finally give some money. And friends, there's lots of good ministries and lots of great nonprofits who are doing wonderfully effective work today, who are still waiting for some one-day givers. Why don't we take a test this summer and see if we are generous with organizations that matter to us, and see if God doesn't do something unique. Let's take that test and see what God does. Now, stay with me here. Don't get mad. Don't get defensive. And if you do get mad or defensive, I'm literally going to be on vacation in 6 hours. So wait till next Monday to tell me about it. But how about we try to eat and sleep better this summer? You see, we've been too quiet on those issues for too long. And I'd really like to skip over verse 15 in our passage today, but it's there. And it says, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Let's eat better this summer. Once again, we live in a great area. Lots of, fresh fruit, vegetables, that kind of stuff. Let's eat better this summer. And then as we eat better, let's take care of our bodies. Let's walk a little bit. Let's see the beauty of the creation around us. Let's prayer walk a little bit. You can do two things at once. You can walk, build up your fitness. You can be praying for people as you walk down the street. It's a great discipline, great exercise to do. And then as we do those things, I think you're going to see an impact on our sleeping. See, this is not usually stuff I bring into the pulpit, but there's just a whole lot of research that tells us that we need 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night to be physically fit, to be sharp mentally, to be in control of our emotions. Guess what? Maybe one of the top 4 questions I ask somebody who, when they call me, are in great crisis, or when I end up in their house, or they end up in my house or in the office and they're in great crisis. One of the top 4 questions is, how are you sleeping, right? Because I've seen this over and over again. People not sleeping well aren't making good decisions, right? I need them to sleep well. And so we need 7 to 9 hours a night is what those doctor people tell us. Teenagers and children need more. And here's my big, bold vision as a pastor. You're going to love this. I've always wanted to pastor a church where people just got enough sleep, right? I mean, that's it. I mean, I'd love to pastor a church for a month where people were sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night. Because I can tell you, you've been there. I've spent a lot of my career chasing issues that were caused by people who are not sleeping, or not sleeping enough, right? You guys are cranky when you're not sleeping. You don't think well. So let's try it. Let's try to eat well, to do some exercise, and to sleep well. This summer, just try it this summer. If we want to go back to the old way after that, that's fine with me, but let's try it. But imagine what our witness would be. Just like Daniel's witness here in the first chapter. It's one of the great missionary stories in all the Bible. Is Daniel going into Babylon and living a life in such a way that the king, the most powerful person in the world, took notice. And then let's read our Bibles this summer. A lot of us have just finished about 8 weeks going through the New Testament or Old Testament, doing that in community together. That was great. If you want to keep doing something like that, talk to me. I'm a big believer. Not only, we got too many people just reading the Bible in their little closets. We need to read the Bible together, so let's try to do some of that this summer. Let's take a test and see what happens. I'm asking us to do what Daniel did when he was surrounded by a culture that did not have the values of God. Again, he didn't get nervous Nelly. He didn't hunker down and say, let's hold on. Let's hold on. Maybe one day God's going to come again, but let's hold on. He engaged the culture that was not like him, that did not have his values. And he said, in that culture, I respectfully ask that I can honor God with what I do, with how I eat. And he said, test me. Test me for 10 days, and then you can make your own judgment. And I want us to say, test us. Test us for a couple of months. And see if, as we live towards the values of our God, let's see if the culture won't respond well to how we're engaging with them and how we're reaching out to them. Let's honor God. Let's follow our guide by focusing on him, focusing on our family, focusing on our friends. And let's be the kind of church that doesn't, with rare exception, produces Daniel, but produces the kind of young people like Daniel constantly, because we're putting our best people, our best resources to that purpose. Will you pray with me?